We need to smash the gangs that are running this vile trade, making a huge amount of money.
The UK's general election is in full swing and immigration is a key issue.
They're making a fortune.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is staking his political future on a controversial plan to expel would-be migrants to Rwanda. Sunak has vowed to stop the boats.
The only way to stop this problem is to say to people who come here illegally, they cannot stay and they will be removed. If I'm your Prime Minister, the planes will go to Rwanda, we will have a deterrent.
Critics of the policy say the Rwanda plan is poorly conceived and illegal according to the UK's own laws. Last year, the UK's highest court backed critics, ruling the scheme lacked protection for basic human rights and was therefore unlawful. The opposition Labour Party and its leader Keir Starmer have pledged to cancel the Rwanda plan if elected.
What I won't do is engage in an expensive gimmick, the Rwanda scheme. If he believed it was going to work, he wouldn't have called an election before it can be tested.
Critics of the policy include members of the Conservative Party. Lord Timothy Kirkhope is one of those dissenting voices. He's a trained lawyer and current member of the UK House of Lords. He's been both a UK MP and a member of European Parliament. In 1995, he served as the UK's immigration minister under then Prime Minister John Major. Up next, Lord Kirkhope speaks to the InnerView. Thanks for joining us on the InnerView. Lord Kirkhope joins us now from our London studio. Good to have you on the programme, sir. There are a lot of things I want to ask you about some of the topical issues, but also more broadly related to your reflections and your career. But let's start with one of the major hot-button immigration issues in the UK right now. Rwanda, the Rwanda policy. You've been opposed to it since its inception. Tell us why.
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to make it very clear, as a former immigration minister myself, that it is, of course, vitally important that we have proper policies in place to deal with immigration, whether that happens to be under our immigration rules or, in fact, in relation to present circumstances to those who come to our shores claiming asylum. And I think it's very important that we do have a humanitarian approach, but at the same time, we also make sure that we can cope with whatever it is that is occurring, the numbers of people coming and so on. And I certainly, I accept that I have not supported the Rwanda policy for a whole lot of reasons. One of them, because I'm not sure that it is going to work in the medium to long term. Secondly, that it does actually put into question our international relations. There is an argument as to whether or not it breaks international law. That is, I think, the jury's still out on that one. But I think more importantly, whether it does or it does not, I think it gives an impression to a lot of our international neighbours and others around the world that we are prepared to break the law if it serves our immediate domestic purposes. And that's something which I, as a lawyer as well, I'm not prepared really to sign up to. So I have opposed the Rwanda policy. And I have suggested to the government that rather than pursuing that policy, it would be much better to look at the very big toolbox that we have of other things that we can do in order to deter and to stop illegality on our borders.
So, Lord Kirkhope, just to unpack this a little bit, a couple of things, and I'm glad you laid it all out. But firstly, you said that the jury's still out. I'm assuming that's for other people to decide, but in your personal capacity, your personal opinion as a politician, as a lawyer, you believe that the policy is illegal?
I think that it does not accord with international conventions, in particular the Refugee Convention of 1951, which of course is extremely clear about the rights of people to claim asylum and to choose where they claim asylum, and to have their cases dealt with in the place that they choose to claim that asylum. The policy on Rwanda, as I'm sure your viewers will know, is one where people are not going to be permitted to claim asylum even in the country they arrive at, i.e. the United Kingdom, and they're going to be sent to Rwanda. Rwanda will be requested to look at their applications. In the event of them being successful, rather than them then immediately coming back to the United Kingdom, which is the place where they wanted to have asylum, they will have to remain in Rwanda permanently. Now that seems to me to be against the convention, 51 convention, and the terms around it. And also, I think it creates some considerable difficulties in terms of precedent in international law. You know, I'm not very happy with it. It's as simple as that, really. And I think there are ways around it, but the government seems quite intent on pursuing this particular policy with this particular country.
You mentioned that they were doing this for domestic purposes. So what are those domestic purposes?
Well, I think it's obvious that most people in Britain, one of their priorities is the question of immigration. They want to be sure, they always have wanted to be sure, that their government is in control of immigration, that it actually, our borders are our borders rather than anybody else's borders to control, and that in the event of people arriving, whether it be to claim asylum or whether it is merely someone arriving on an immigration basis, they want to be quite sure that the government is in control. My own view is that the government is in control. It does not need to demonstrate anything further, but it needs to underline and remind people of the measures which we have in place to protect them when it comes to the question of migrancy.
Tell me about the politicking that underpins the slogans, stop the boats and, you know, secure our borders. Tell me what drives Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman when they push out these messages.
Well, it wasn't their slogan, of course. The slogan came, I think, some time ago. I believe it may have originated under Boris Johnson. I'm not sure when it originated, but of course we are now in a world of social media. We're in a world where slogans seem to replace policies. And my worry is that the slogan, which of course the sentiment of that we all agree with. I don't want to see people getting into a boat and putting themselves in peril as they cross the channel. That's appalling. You know, and similarly, of course, when I was a European Member of Parliament, I had the same issues with regard to the Mediterranean, with great numbers of people who put themselves at great danger to cross from North Africa into either Malta or Italy. Stopping those boats, stopping that situation is something we all agree with, but using it as a slogan, I'm afraid it leaves it rather open to everybody's individual interpretation as to what it means, or at least how it is actually put into effect. That's the point.
Does this make you a rebel from among the Tories, where you're in agreement with Labour, where you're in agreement with those who are hell-bent against everything that the Tories stand for? Where does that place you personally?
No, I'm a very limited. You put the word rebel. I don't regard myself as a rebel at all, really. I'm a conservative, and I have had one or two disagreements. Only one or two, by the way. One is over our policy on Europe and future relationship with Europe, and the other one is in connection with this particular means of dealing with asylum seekers. That's about all. I mean, otherwise, I'm a fairly loyal conservative. In fact, my voting record is probably one of the best in defence of the government. And I think that will always be the case. I have no intention of joining the Labour Party or, in fact, over-sympathising with them, because I'm not absolutely convinced, to be frank, that the Labour Party has a better idea or fuller idea of how to deal with these matters.
I'm glad you mentioned both of these issues because they seem to be related. As an outsider looking in, the relationship with Europe leading to Brexit, did it trigger the tone that we're seeing now on immigration, on migrants, this kind of populism, nativist populism that is emerging? Did it start with Brexit?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think Brexit certainly had a lot to do with it. And I was very unhappy, obviously, about the result of that referendum. I was very unhappy that we left the European Union. I had been a member of the European Parliament for 17 years at that time. So I was very unhappy about that result. And I feel that having lost that argument for the time being, I was hopeful, very hopeful, and still am very hopeful, that the government, this government, or indeed any future government of any complexion, will have one of its priorities making sure that its relationship with Europe is as close as is possible, bearing in mind the fact that we are not full members or members of the EU itself. And that's something which I shall be pursuing, whichever government we have after the general election.
You say, of course, you're still a conservative, a principled conservative. It seems as if the type of conservatism that is doing well around the world, not just in the UK, is the one with a populist twist, whether it's Trump or Boris. How do you feel about that? Why is it that this is happening, and how does that make you feel as a conservative?
Well, I think there is a level of frustration in a lot of countries where people feel sometimes their politicians have not been listening sufficiently to what they are thinking and saying. And I think also the world situation is such that in a way, because of the threats to us, partly COVID, of course, the whole threats of climate, the actual threats, geopolitical threats, the threats in terms of militancy around the world, I think there is in fact an inclination in all countries for people to turn inwards a bit, to actually think probably the most important thing is to make sure whatever else is going on around the world, that within their own borders they have safety and security. And so consequently that does lead, I think, to people being more nationalistic. And incidentally, there's nothing wrong with being loyal to your country or to talk up your country, which I do. Britain is a marvellous country and its people are great. But I think there is now in the political scene certainly a strong movement towards more nationalism or at least more statements of independence, which means, in our case, not perhaps moving too quickly to be back connected or working too closely with the European Union.
So you mentioned that Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman were not the ones that came up with those particular slogans. It came from Boris Johnson's era. And you could even maybe, if we look at what they call the Overton window, we could maybe even look at Nigel Farage and UKIP setting the tone for some of the messaging. And I'm assuming you and Nigel Farage were seated near each other in the European Parliament for a bunch of years. Tell me about how much that sort of far right dragged the right into its direction on these issues over the years.
Well, certainly. I mean, Farage and his friends, and now Richard Tice, the Reform Party in the UK now, is trying its best to reflect, if you like, the more narrow views, the less thinking views that exist in the country. And again, they are capitalizing dramatically, as is happening in other countries. I mean, Germany is another case in point, where the AfD has been building up support in some of the former East German states, in particular. And I think this is really partly because we're in an age now where, as I said a moment ago, social media has become rather more important. So if you can get across a message that hits the nerves, as it were, in one sentence, or certainly within enough words that fits with a Twitter or X account, then you do that rather than having a sensible and comprehensive discussion or putting forward your policies in a comprehensive way, which people can respond to. And this was always what we used to be, I think, years ago. Now it's no longer there. We're in such a hurry now to try and make turn everything into a few words. If those words trigger off the right kind of sentiments or emotions, then in a way it's a shortcut for politicians to try and get support.
If your opposition fails, you and your reluctant bedfellows, Labour and others, to this immigration policy, downstream of it, if you start to see hundreds of people or even thousands of people being sent to Rwanda over the years, tell me what's going to happen downstream of this. What do you foresee 5 years from now?
Well, I mean, I think it depends, obviously, on what happens in the general election. I mean, I have said my piece on Rwanda in a way. I've made it clear where I stand and why I think it's not necessary and why we can deal with these matters in different ways. But the government now has its legislation, and the government now is proceeding with its policy. The general election is going to intervene. The question then would be, if the Conservatives lose the election and Labour win, would Labour maintain that Rwanda policy? And the answer, they've made it very clear so far that they would not. The question of what they would then do is open to debate and discussion. And I would certainly want to be advising, if it were a Labour government, I'd be wanting to advise them equally strongly to pursue certain measures rather than what I think they may have in mind. And certainly I would be in support if they were to find other ways of dealing with this rather than the Rwanda policy.
Is all of this an example of Britain wrestling with its identity and what it wants to be and how it wants to live in this modern world?
I think it's very difficult. Britain, is an enormously important nation. It has one of the strongest economies in the world still. It certainly has a strong defence presence, even though there's much criticism saying that we should put more money into defence, which I would also incidentally agree very strongly in view of the world situation. But Britain is not at all a written-off state. It is actually very, very significant and plays a major part in international discussions, and it always will. But of course we are now, in many people's minds, a third country. We are now outside of the EU, where we had alliances that I think were very important. I think other countries perhaps don't rate us as highly, because when we look at our population of 60-odd million compared with the populations of many other countries that are represented in blocks that have got together, then of course in terms of the future challenges, the challenges from China, for instance, indeed challenges from the United States and indeed other parts of the world that are growing and getting into blocks together, then of course we have to find our role and re-find a role. My own view is it is a role in which we have to play with partners, not without them. And I think that is where there is a distinction in politics in this country at the moment, between those who think we can do everything alone and that by saying we are leading the world will then come on side and follow us, as opposed to those like myself who think that the best way forward for Britain, even though Britain is strong, and to get greater strength, is to work with others in alliances and to build up friendships and connections and give people some kind of trust in our reliability if we get into those new arrangements.
You've served as a local politician, you were an MP, you were an MEP, so you would have been in Brussels and Strasbourg, and in the House of Lords. So that's sort of the grand slam. You've done all four. I don't know if there's anybody else who's done all four. Tell me how they compare and contrast.
I'm not sure there is. I don't think there is at the moment. I've been looking around to try and find someone that I can say is equal in that sense, and I haven't found anybody yet. But I've had the lot. I've been able, through a combination of extremely hard work, but also good luck, to be right through the political process in my life. And I think that has been enormously important to me, and it's given me the sort of level of experience, particularly dealing with people at different levels, which I think actually has been very important in my decision making and also the postures that I've taken politically.
Compare them for me.
Compare the different roles?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, apart from my present position where I'm in an unelected body appointed by David Cameron, all the way through my rest of my political life, I have been totally dependent on the public, on people. And I have never forgotten that. And whilst I don't spend a lot of time with rhetoric, and I've tried always not to reduce things to too simple a form for the understanding of voters, for instance, I do believe that the connections I've had with people at ground level, which I have been careful to maintain, have been invaluable.
You served under David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. He's now Foreign Secretary. How's he doing?
He's doing very well. I think it was people were wondering what sort of line he would take on things and how he would manage. I mean, he really is a shining example of someone whose time has come again. The country at the moment does certainly need to have a strong foreign secretary, and we need also to have a pragmatic person in that place rather than someone who's too dogmatic, because that is the other point about international relations. I have always been a great pragmatist, while some of my colleagues run around saying, you know, we can't do deals with that country or this country or whatever it may be because of this, that and the other. My view is that we should always have a door remaining open and be pragmatic in our dealings as widely as possible.
What is the pragmatic approach to what's going on in Gaza right now?
I mean, Gaza is an appalling situation. The international bodies that are looking at it consider that there are problems on both sides of that situation. I think that in many ways, again, David Cameron has probably taken the right position on this. First of all, obviously, we are concerned for the security and integrity of Israel, and we've been strong supporters of Israel for many years, and I think that is right. But ultimately, I think certainly my view is, ultimately there must be a two-state solution in the Middle East, and that the Palestinian people, hopefully under democratic and sane leaders, can actually put together the statehood which I think they're entitled to have. But I think at the moment we do have, of course, we're in the middle of a conflict, and I'm hoping very much that certainly from the point of view of ordinary people, people who are not part of any militant operation, we must do our best to try to make sure that they don't suffer too much. And they have suffered, of course, we know that. But the key point is that ultimately there has to be some arrangement. Otherwise, I'm afraid that conflict will grow, and indeed it will become much more difficult to sort it out.
And tapping into your solicitor's expertise, the ICC's arrest warrants for Netanyahu on the one end and Sinwar on the other, helpful or harmful?
I don't think it's particularly helpful at the moment, actually, because, of course, both sides have reacted to it pretty strongly. And I think, although I respect the ICC, I think it's very important that it should exist and do its work. I don't think it's timely at the moment for that to happen.
That's optics, timely or not. In terms of the legality of it all, is it a sound legal argument? Have you looked closely at it?
Well, I haven't looked terribly closely at it, to be honest with you. My feeling is that there were pressures there which were reflected in the decisions that were taken, and I think those pressures were not necessarily all legal ones.
What are the pressures?
Well, I think there were political pressures, outside pressures, state pressures from various elements. And I think that there was a feeling also that if they were going to take a particular view about one side of this argument, they would have to try and balance it on the other side. And I think that that is always a dangerous situation to get into.
Okay, interesting. It's been fascinating mining your expertise and getting your thoughts on a range of issues. Lord Kirkhope, thank you very much for joining us on the InnerView.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Take care.